Welcome to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today because we're unpacking a truly dark, honestly mind-boggling piece of history. We're heading straight back to 1870s Boston to examine a case that completely shocked the nation and really challenged the very foundations of the American justice system. We're looking at the chilling, true story of Jesse Pomeroy, who is widely recognized as America's youngest serial killer.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Because, this entire story centers around one massive, glaring anomaly. How in the world does a child, someone barely on the cusp of adolescence, manage to literally paralyze a major American city with fear? Well, to understand that, we really need to trace the escalation of events exactly as they unfolded. And it all starts with a series of brutal, unsolved attacks on other local children.
Section 1. The Mysterious Youth. So, before there were actual murders, this unprecedented reign of terror gripped the suburbs of Boston. It was perpetrated by this unidentified, larger boy who kept luring younger kids into secluded areas. And you can really see the rapid, brutal escalation here. Look at this. In December 1871, a young boy named Payne is lured up to Powderhorn Hill, tied to a beam, and just beaten unconscious. By February 1872, another boy, Tracy Hayden, is taken to that exact same spot, tortured, and his nose is actually broken with a board. Fast forward to July, Johnny Balch suffers a similar fate, but get this, his attacker then forces him down to a nearby creek to agonizingly wash his fresh wounds with salt water. Just incredibly cruel. And by the fall of 1872, the frequency and severity absolutely spike. 4 more boys, Gould, Austin, Pratt, and Kennedy, are enticed out to secluded spots, like a railroad track or even a yacht cabin in South Boston, where they are stripped, beaten, and stabbed.
Now, the police were scrambling. A huge number of boys were arrested on suspicion during this time, but they all ended up getting discharged. Finally, though, the victims were able to positively identify their attacker. And it was Jesse Pomeroy. He was just 12 years old. 12! He lived with his widowed mother, who worked as a poor dressmaker right there in South Boston. This wasn't some grown man creeping around the suburbs. It was literally a neighborhood kid. Because of his extreme youth, the justice system didn't send him to a traditional prison. It was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the much-sought youth responsible for all these horrific tortures. So he was sentenced to serve out the remainder of his minority at the Westboro Reform School.
Section 2. A Fatal Probation. This is where we see what is, frankly, a catastrophic system failure, one that ultimately set the stage for Pomeroy's most lethal crimes. According to the customs of the reform school at the time, if confined boys showed, quote, exemplary behavior, and authorities felt confident that their good conduct would continue, they were often released on probation, provided they had a good home to return to. Tragically, authorities genuinely believed Jesse fit this criteria, so he was released on February 6, 1874. The tragic irony here is almost hard to stomach. The authorities unlocked the door precisely because they thought the danger had passed. I want us to slow down for a second here and look really closely at these dates. He was released in early February. Barely a month later, on March 8th, a 10-year-old girl named Katie Curran, who lived right in the same neighborhood as the Pomeroy home, mysteriously vanishes. The only clue they have is a report of a girl entering a buggy with a strange man, which completely throws police off track, leading them to mistakenly suspect an abduction by an adult. Then, just weeks later, on April 22, 1874, the body of 4-year-old Horace Mullen is found dumped in a marsh near Dorchester. The local horrors had resumed almost immediately. The sheer brutality of the Mullen boys' murder was absolutely shocking. This tiny 4-year-old victim suffered 31 knife wounds. 31. His head was nearly severed from his body. And, remembering the violent past record of Jesse Pomeroy, officials naturally and immediately suspected him. Section 3. The Muddy Footprints.
The investigation phase following that horrific discovery in the Dorchester Marsh was incredibly swift, and this brilliantly illustrates how police methodically built circumstantial evidence against him, especially in an era way before modern forensics. They took Pomeroy into custody the very next day. First off, they found a knife in his possession with blood right near the handle, even though the blade itself was wiped clean. Second, they found mud on his shoes that perfectly matched the unique soil of those marshlands. Finally, investigators actually traced footprints through the marsh, poured plaster casts of them, and matched them perfectly, not just to the size of Pomeroy's shoes, but to his specific, unique gait.
Armed with all this evidence, they brought the young teenager into the room where the child's body lay.
and the interrogation exchange is chillingly brief. The officer asked him, "Do you know this boy?" Pomeroy said, "Yes, sir." Then the officer asked, "Did you kill him?" Pomeroy just casually replied, "I suppose I did." When they asked how he got the blood off the murder weapon, he coldly explained that he just stuck it in the mud. Later medical examinations concluded the boy was perfectly sane. He simply derived pleasure from torturing others, and he targeted children because, well, he had the physical ability to force them to his will. As for the mystery of the missing current girl, well, that was solved just a few months later. In July of 1874, Mrs. Pomeroy's landlord actually sold the property, and the new owner started excavating the cellar to make some improvements. Under a pile of ashes and stones, laborers found the decomposed remains of a little girl. Mr. and Mrs. Kern were brought in, and they tragically identified their child's clothing. Since Pomeroy had been seen with the child previously, he finally broke down and confessed that he was the one who murdered her and buried her remains right there in the basement.
Section 4. Sparing the noose. With those confessions officially secured, the narrative shifts into this unprecedented political gridlock over what a civilized society is supposed to do with a convicted child murderer. On December 10, 1874, Pomeroy was sentenced to be hanged. But look at the massive friction between the courts and the executive branch here. The Supreme Court sustained the death sentence. However, Governor William Gaston flat out refused to sign the death warrant, entirely because of Pomeroy's extreme youth. And then his successor, Governor Rice, he refused to sign it for the exact same reason. The only legal workaround they had left was the Massachusetts Governor's Council, and it took them a year and a half. They voted 3 separate times before they finally commuted his sentence to life in prison in solitary confinement.
So, on the evening of September 7, 1876, he was transferred to the state prison at Charlestown to begin his life in solitary. And to put this into perspective, he was just 16 years and 9 months old when those cell doors locked behind him.
Section 5. Life in solitary.
This final chapter of his life spans decades, and it is just filled with incredible contradictions. For many years, Pomeroy was absolutely relentless in his attempts to break out. A 1914 psychiatric report actually noted that he had made 10 to 12 highly determined attempts to escape, showing some unprecedented ingenuity. The prison warden was frequently finding handmade tools hidden in his cell, things like rope, steel pens, even homemade drills. In one particularly violent attempt, he actually figured out how to redirect a gas pipe in his cell to create an explosive blast, aiming to just destroy the wall. The explosion failed to breach the door, but the blast cost him his right eye.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast between his violent, destructive escape attempts and his intense intellectual pursuits. While he was confined completely alone for decades, he somehow taught himself to read foreign languages. He learned Arabic and mastered German with considerable accuracy. He wrote poetry and aggressively argued with officials for the right to publish it. He pored over law books, spending decades composing complex legal challenges and pardon requests. And physically, despite living in solitary confinement, by 1909 he had developed into an incredibly powerful, muscular man in perfect health. But as time marched on, that fire eventually began to fade. In 1917, his sentence was commuted just enough to allow him the basic privileges of other life prisoners. Now, at first, he stubbornly resisted this, wanting absolutely nothing less than a full, unconditional pardon. But he did eventually adjust to his new circumstances, even appearing in a prison minstrel show. By 1929, though, the once powerful man had become elderly and frail. He was transferred over to Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane, where he finally died on September 29, 1932. This case leaves us with an incredibly heavy, enduring question. When doctors and investigators determine that a perpetrator is perfectly sane, yet fundamentally a, quote, natural fiend who derives true pleasure from the torture of others, how is the justice system supposed to handle that monster when they are still, legally and physically, just a child? It's a dark contradiction that absolutely paralyzed 1870s Boston, and it's a question that makes the history of America's youngest serial killer completely impossible to forget. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive gave you a clear, structured understanding of a truly complex piece of history.